Good morning, everyone. It is November 15th, and this video is going to discuss why I personally do not think a winter lull is going to happen, despite what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, has said. He cites World War I level tactics. Warfare has largely changed, and even so, those World War I level tactics were in a different area of Europe than what Ukraine is facing in Russia. So there's a couple of things that are not exactly the same. First of which is the technology, the capability of soldiers to stay warm while staying safe has advanced significantly, as it would over 100 years. And it's almost like General Milley ignored the fact that in World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, which was Germany's really their last major offensive, happened in the wintertime. The Winter War between the Soviet Union and Finland took place in wintertime. So wars no longer have to stop for winter. This isn't like the Civil War. This isn't World War I. Advanced militaries can continue to fight through the winter. And the reality is the conditions really aren't going to get any worse than they have been over the last month or two, because they've seen extraordinarily muddy conditions. And if there's anything worse than frozen ground or just standard ground, it's muddy ground. And they've continued to fight through that, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. So when the winter freezes the ground, it will make it even more conducive for large-scale mechanized maneuver warfare. So I think combat is actually going to pick up over the kind of slow plodding pace we've seen. When I say slow and plodding, it doesn't mean that Ukraine didn't quickly take Kherson, but let's be honest, that wasn't necessarily a battle. That was an attrition fight of Russians losing equipment, losing people, therefore making it untenable to hold. So they just left. There was no fighting taking place in any kind of major scale. Yes, there were skirmishes and probing attacks and things of that nature. So, like I said, a cessation of fighting or a prolonged slowing of combat operations in Ukraine is not going to happen over the next few months. Any attempt at a ceasefire or any kind of cessation of fighting or hostilities overwhelmingly favors Russia, and it makes sense. The reason it favors Russia is due to the Russians needing longer lead time for force generation, longer lead time for logistics backfill. And so the best thing that can happen to Russia is a ceasefire. It gives those Russian forces a longer time to recover and allows the reservists that they've called up to flow into the theater, gives them the time to integrate into their units, gives them time to train up, and then prepares them for more serious combat next year. That shouldn't be allowed by Ukraine. Ukraine needs to continue to press the offensive, and they likely will, because Ukraine received massive donations of winter gear from Western nations. And from what I've seen in the videos and on Telegram and other various feeds is that Russia was expecting a lull to come, so they improperly equipped its forces and vehicles for winter. Meanwhile, many donations, like I said, are going to Ukraine so they can continue to fight in the winter. In fact, Germany's setting up maintenance bays and maintenance areas in Slovakia to help with what is usually a greater demand for maintenance in the wintertime on this equipment. So Ukraine is setting itself up to continue to fight through the winter. Now, Putin continues to show his ass as a complete buffoon in tactics, which frankly is understandable because he's never served in the military and he's making tactical and strategic decisions that are not good. They're flat out errors. And these disastrous offensives that Putin keeps trying to nickel and dime at the Ukrainians is getting Russians killed. And it's allowing Ukraine to strategically exploit these areas. And Napoleon famously said, "Never interrupt your enemy as they are making a mistake." And Western-trained Ukraine has consistently shown its ability to not only allow Russia to make those mistakes, but goad Russia into massive blunders. And Putin has to lean into this stupidity because his hardline supporters are really all he has left, to include the media. And they are pressing for, we need movement, we need advancement in Russia, rather than trying to pull back. And defend and regenerate. Well, it's probably too late for Russia to do that. And we've seen those media cracks as well. So a ceasefire is not going to happen. One, because Ukraine's not going to allow it because Putin will demand outlandish concessions. So Ukraine has no reason to agree to them. And they have no reason to stop driving Russia out. Really, the only thing that could seriously stop a Ukrainian push in the near term, and even this I don't think is tenable for Russia, is nuclear weapons. Because tactical nuclear weapons, like General Hodges said, makes a big boom in a small place. So having units spread throughout Ukraine, you'd have to use a massive amount of nuclear weapons to take out any kind of meaningful amount of combat power for the Ukrainians. And nukes are largely out of the question for Russia, as the United States, Europe, and China have warned against Russia using them. So as such, Ukraine will keep pressure up because they have the initiative. But Russia will also try to keep pressure up because Putin has to show that he's doing something. And this is evidenced by the rocket attack that took place today. Hundreds of guided, but mostly unguided rockets were fired, of which 80 to 90% hit civilian infrastructure, likely on purpose, but also probably likely because they're unguided, dumb rockets and they're just firing them. That's a terrorist state activity. But do not be surprised. And I want to emphasize this at the end here. Don't be surprised if we don't see major territorial gains by Ukraine in the next few weeks to months. Having secured Kherson, they are having to reevaluate how they're going to proceed with the war. They absolutely want to take the territory, but the timeline to do so is conducive to Ukraine rather than just trying to blitz into areas. Do what they did in Kherson, and that's attrit equipment and personnel in those regions. So when Russian supporters inevitably show up in my feed and say, how come Ukraine hasn't taken more land? Russia's basically won the war. What has actually happened is Ukraine is once again focusing on attritting Russian troops and equipment. This prevents Russia from holding territory, and it degrades their overall force capability at the same time. And this will allow Ukraine to have an easier time to take that in the future. Think of how Kherson went. There was no major battle for that city. Ukraine just made it impossible for Russia to occupy that area. This is a similar tactic they likely will take in other regions. So don't think that if the operations map isn't changing much, that nothing's happening. In fact, the Ukrainians are probably doing the same thing they did before, hitting supply lines, hitting command and control nodes, hitting troops, conducting skirmishes, making it very painful for Russia to occupy an area so that they attrit their personnel and equipment, destroy their morale even more, and forces the Russians to essentially leave or face a larger scale destruction in the future. And that's what happened to Kherson. So we may see that exact same tactic going forward. I just want to put that out because that is this tactic has worked for Ukraine in the past, and there's no reason to say that it won't work in the future. So when inevitably there's what we would see as quote unquote a lull, it's not really a lull, it's just the way the Ukrainians are treating the Russians so that they can maintain their forces and their equipment while destroying Russian forces and Russian equipment, so that it's an easier time for them to stroll into the cities they want to take back in the future. So that's it. Have a great day, everyone. And I'll try to get some other videos out. Interesting things taking place with regard to a meeting between Biden and Xi, but we'll see. I also have work stuff to do. So have a good day, everyone.